Hello to all, and thank you for joining us at JNation 2020. I hope that you are all having a great time with us and enjoying our sessions. In this session, we will have Fluin presenting what's new in Angular. Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day here in California.
All right. Here in Portugal, it's almost it's evening, almost nighttime. So, are you ready to rock this session?
I'm ready to rock and roll.
Okay, so I will hand over to you. Thanks for being with us, and you can start.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be involved in all these events around the globe because there's so many people in the community that we just don't have enough time to talk to and be a part of. But we want to support as many people as we can. So whenever we can find an opportunity like this, it is really exciting to engage with the community and share kind of some of the things we're up to, as well as listen to what you're doing. So today we're talking a little bit about what's new in Angular. And so for us, that really means starting with the concept of version 9. And so in order for me to talk effectively about what we're doing, I just want to make sure everyone knows kind of who I am. So my name is Stephen Fluin, and I lead developer relations on the Angular team at Google. And so my job has a ton of really amazing parts. It used to be that I would travel the world, but I don't do that so much anymore. But really my mission is to help developers be successful with Angular, but then also to understand what it's like sitting on the other side of the screen where you're out there building applications and really trying to reflect those needs, reflect those understandings back onto the Angular team so that we can make really good choices for the product overall. So we're here today to talk about what's new in Angular. A lot of people already know about this, but I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So the big news in the Angular ecosystem right now is that version 9 is out. That's a big milestone for us, and this is going to be a lot of what we talk about today because it includes a lot of features and a lot of changes for the developer ecosystem. But to be more specific, we're not actually on version 9 anymore. The most recent version is 9.1, so woohoo about that as well. And there's not a ton new in version 9.1 that's separate from version 9. So I'm going to talk about these kind of together as a single set. So if you're on the latest version of Angular, there are a ton of benefits that you are going to get. And the big thing here is that we've actually been talking about some of these benefits for years now. This was me on stage at an event a couple of years ago where we were talking about the plans that we had for Ivy and for the Angular ecosystem and for the product. And it was a long time ago that we started introducing some of these things and started like mentioning them at every conference, every event. But we're really, really fortunate that in version 9, we were able to actually achieve some of these things and ship out some of these features. So the big thing that everyone kind of knows about is Ivy. And so we'll be talking a lot about that. A lot of these features are related to Ivy. But in general, there's about 12 different features that I'm going to go through that were kind of major updates to your ecosystem over the last few months. So let's kind of dive in. So I mentioned this thing called Ivy. So if you don't know, Ivy is a project that the Angular team took on to rewrite some of the internals of Angular. We basically rewrote the compiler and we rewrote the runtime of Angular. So what that means is the way that we convert your templates into JavaScript that actually runs in the browser changed a little bit. And we did this to get a number of different benefits for developers. Under the hood, this for us means that there was a bunch of complexity around how the compilation and how the runtime works. So we used to have these things called factories or ng factories, where every time you compiled a component, every time you compiled a module, we would be taking that component class that you created and translating that into something else. And so there was this weird mismatch between the factory and the actual class or the actual component that you were thinking about as a developer. So we've gotten rid of that barrier, we've gotten rid of that difference. And so now the classes that you write, the classes that you ship are actually the same ones that you ship to production. Our compiler and runtime are really rewritten with this concept of locality really at the front of our minds, where we want you to be able to build an Angular application and be able to compile that Angular application without having to have global knowledge. With our old compiler and runtime that we call View Engine, we used to have global knowledge effectively to do any sort of compilation. We'd have to know how to resolve the modules, how to resolve the components, all those things at build time. Whereas now we can resolve a lot of that more at runtime by this principle of locality. And we've moved to an instruction set that is kind of brand new, and it's really designed to both allow for locality, but also give a whole bunch of other different benefits like improved tree shaking and improved debuggability. So that's a lot of what Ivy means. If you think about the kind of our Ivy strategy overall, the first thing that we're doing is really focusing on the ease of updates. What we want to do is we have this big bang rewrite between developers that are using View Engine and into the kind of under the hood changes. And we want to do this without any public API changes, right? Like we've virtually completely succeeded at that. So there's just a few minor changes to Angular, but really what we want to do is we wanted to make everyone able to go from version 8 to version 9, turn on Ivy without even knowing about it, and their app just keeps working. And this is kind of essential to the Angular team philosophy on every major update, is we want these updates to be as easy and as direct as possible. But what we really see is that Ivy is an enabler, right? What we released in version 9, getting everyone on Ivy, is going to allow us to do a lot of great things in the future, where while version 9, as we're going to see, has some bundle size improvements, they are not the only bundle size improvements we can do. We have a lot of ideas around this. We have a lot of great vision that we are excited to start bringing to people. But before we could do any of these cool improvements to the Angular platform, we had to get Ivy out there. We had to get this refactoring out. And we had to get all the developers out there using it. So the first benefit I want to talk about that really comes directly from this Ivy rewrite is bundle sizes. So it's a little bit of a complicated picture because there's a lot of different Angular apps out there. On one end of the spectrum, we have small applications. So let's imagine you just create a hello world application. You don't use any of the features of Angular. So you don't have very much code that you've written, and you're not using very much of Angular. So those apps, they're going to see about a 30% size reduction. Then if we consider, for example, medium applications, we're still going to see a size reduction, but we're not going to see the same level of size reduction. So that's cases where, for example, you're using a lot of Angular, but you don't write a lot of code. And then the last type of application we see is large applications, where if you write a lot of Angular code and you use a lot of Angular features, you're still going to see a huge size reduction. And what happens and how this works is that we made tree shaking better. So features of Angular you use are going to be left out from your production bundle, or at least more features. And this is something we want to continue investing in, which means that if you have a small app, but you use all the features, we can't really leave that much out of your bundle. But the other thing that we did is we made the generated code, these instructions that we're shipping down to the browser, much smaller. And so if you have a lot of code that you've written, and this is actually most applications, you're going to see a large size decrease in your bundle. And generally, if the importance of bundle size is that the smaller you can make your bundle and the more you can lazy load your code in your application, the better the experience your users are going to have. And when we're thinking about building great applications, it is critical to be thinking about the experience our users have, even on mobile, disconnected, offline, low internet scenarios. One of the great examples that we had out there from the ecosystem was that their application decreased by 11 megabytes. So I will say 25 megabytes seems like a crazy application, but if you're doing a lot of functionality and you're using lazy loading effectively, this can actually be good. So what they saw is that their lazy loaded modules went down from 900 KB to 500 KB. And so that is kind of a huge, really, really positive improvement to their application. Another example was that this person updated a mid-size application, and their bundle size went from 973 KB to 669. So 30% code improvement without doing anything. And those are the sorts of improvements that we did in version 4, we did in version 5, we did in version 6. This is something you're going to keep seeing in Angular, where your applications keep getting better without having to change a single line of code. And that's something that we really, really take to heart. The second feature that I want to talk about is faster unit tests, all the way up to the extent of these tests are now between 40 and 50% faster. And the big change that we made here is that historically with unit tests in Angular, we would actually have to compile all of your components once for every single test. But what we've done is we've now designed it so that you can compile the components and modules, etc., once, and then that gets reused across multiple unit tests in a safe way that still protects the concept of unit testing. And so this just means that all of your tests are going to run much faster, and the more tests you have, the faster it's going to run. We've also dramatically improved the concept of debugging. So one of the things you're going to see once you update to version 9 is that you're going to see a new global object on the window, which is called ng. And this new global object is going to give you a bunch of really cool debugging features in development mode. So I want to actually give a demo of a couple of these. So we're going to go into live coding. And this is my son, Daniel. He is the best live coder, but he's not available right now. So I'm going to have to step in for him and try and take his place. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to a terminal here. And we're going to see we have a brand new application that I just spun up using the latest version of Angular. So just whatever's straight off the internet, this works perfectly in version 9 as well. And then I ran ng-serve. So if we take a look at the source code, this should look like a blank, brand new Angular application where you've got source app. You can see we've got an app component. This is all default Angular app. And then what I can do is I can pull up a browser and I can actually load localhost 4200. And we'll see that application. So the debugging app is running. We've got a ton of code here. And what we'll do is just to show off some of the debugging is I'm going to delete all the template. So that should have nothing there. And then what I can do is I can put back that title debugging. So this app is title. So that should work. We should now have an app. We'll make that a little bit bigger. So very, very simple Angular application straight out of the box with the CLI. And you can see that this property right here is bound into the component that we're looking at. So one of the things I can do now is I can open the dev tools. So let's pop that open. And we can see, hey, we've got, here's our whole DOM tree, and I can pick that app root. One of the cool things you can do now is in the console, if we close the settings there, you may know this or you may not know this. In DevTools, you can always hit $0 to refer to the actual element that you have selected in the element pane. And so what you can do is you can do something like component equals ng.getComponent and just pass it $0. And what that gives you is instead of a DOM node, it's actually going to give you the actual class, the actual instance of the component sitting in memory. And so what you'll notice is all the properties that exist on the component are going to be here. All of the methods that exist on the component are going to be here. And so what you can actually do is you can do something like comp.title equals hello, everyone. And what will happen is that will update the class. So that will update the property directly. And so this is a really, really nice way for developers to reach in and poke different parts of their application and understand what's going on, test, debug, figure out what's going on under the hood. So let's actually execute this, and we'll see that within the data model, the title will change, but we won't actually see anything in the UX. So when I hit comp.title, we now see that the title is hello, everyone, but you notice that that has not actually applied to DOM. And that's because Angular has a separate process for actually rendering out to the DOM called change detection. And so we can actually trigger change detection if we want. So we can call ng.apply changes on our component, and then we're going to see that change. So these are tools that we want to make developers' lives easier. We want it to be a really, really simple process of taking an Angular application and getting Angular out of the way, so to say. We want to show and expose these direct classes so you can call the methods, update the properties, debug them in real time, which we're kind of really, really excited about. So that is kind of the core. There's a lot of other cool features of debugging in Angular that you can do. You can do, for example, breakpoints. So if you have a change detection that throws an error, you can actually throw a breakpoint directly into a template now, which is really cool. You'll see that directly in sources. You'll see errors mapping direct to change detection on a single element in the HTML. So really lots of cool features, but I'm going to keep moving here because we've got a lot to talk about and a lot to demo. So jumping back to the slides. What we just showed off was basically ng debugging, right? Using this global ng object, you can see that we can get a hold of components, you can touch them, modify them, you can access their services, you can really do anything because you're accessing real JavaScript code at runtime. Another of the capabilities that we've done to improve debugging is that we've added improved TypeScript strictness. So for a long time, we've had this thing called full template type check, which basically says that we should check most of the things in the template. But there were actually gaps in that. We weren't type checking dynamic templates, for example, within an ngIf or within an ng4. So there was some places where we weren't actually enforcing the right type checking. So we have a new option in order to allow a compatible kind of slow migration into this called strict templates. So what this new option does is it follows the strictest rule. So not only does it allow you to do full template type checking, so we check the entire template, so everything in dynamic code, ngIfs, ng4, all those sorts of things, ng templates, but we also apply a level of strictness that can correspond with the same sort of strictness that you'd expect from something like TypeScript, where you can turn on and off even more strict flags. And so an example of that here is that a lot of people don't know that, for example, a click event doesn't actually show or doesn't return the target as a DOM node. It returns it on as like a clickable or an event object or an event target. And so you might notice some weird typings if you're doing, if you switch over to strict templates and you're relying on the typings to match up between what you expect in the DOM, where you might expect a DOM node back, but you're actually, according to the JavaScript standard and the browser implementation, getting back a different type of object. So you'll actually have to take care of some of those use cases yourself to make sure you're building a high quality application. So there is something that we've done on the CSS binding. So if you didn't know this, you can bind to CSS in Angular a lot of different ways. You can put CSS directly into a style tag of an element. You can put it into a component. You can put it into a directive. And previously how it used to work was that all of these things were last change detected wins. So whatever change detection, whatever value was modified most recently, that would overwrite all of the previous values. And that wasn't the greatest. And even though we could have re-implemented that for compatibility, we didn't really want to do that. So what we did is we came up with a defined way that this would apply. And then we took that and we actually defined that, and so that people can actually understand it. So the first thing we do is we evaluate template bindings. So similar to CSS, where you want kind of this increasing specificity. So if you do something directly in your template, that is going to override what we see similar to like when you do in normal CSS, style equals, you want that to override the CSS style sheet that's attached to the page. We do the same thing. So template bindings, that could be class.foo, that could be style within a DOM node. Then we apply directives. So directives are the next level. So if you don't have any template bindings, then we're going to apply the directive host bindings. So this allows you to say, hey, if I have a mat button, but I'm also elevating that mat button with some other directive, we want the directive to apply, not the component. So we do directive host bindings next. And then finally, we end with the component level. So the idea is if some generic component you're using has a style, we'll use it. But if you've also supplied a directive, we're going to apply that instead. And if you've also applied a template binding, we're going to use that instead. So this makes sense. It matches somewhat the specificity of CSS overall. Build errors are another area where we've made huge improvements in Angular. So if you take a look at an ng build command where things don't go as expected, we've dramatically improved the error messages. So you're going to see much better formatting here. You're going to see an error code. You're going to see an explanation of the error. You're going to see this nice coloring. And so we just tried to improve the developer experience for anyone that's doing any sort of debugging or runs into issues, because this is one of the areas that we have lots of ideas for long term. Is when things go off the rails in Angular, how do we help you get back into understanding about your application and building a great application? So we already talked about test speed, but we've also made build speed a lot faster. So what we're seeing is that build speed on average is about 40% faster, which is kind of a huge improvement. And one of the ways that we did this was that previously ngCC, this compatibility compiler, it would run in sequence. And so in order to ensure compatibility between Ivy applications and non-Ivy applications, what we've done is we've asked all library authors to keep shipping the Vue engine version of their library. So not using the Ivy mode, so to say, to do the compilation, and just allowing that the application does that Ivy compilation. So to make the single cohesive ecosystem work, what we do is we pass all of the old library formats through this compatibility compiler. And so we used to do this one by one. So we would take one of your dependencies, pass it through compatibility compiler, and then the next, and then the next. As of 9.1, we can actually run all these in parallel, which is a dramatic speed improvement to the build process of Angular. In a long enough timeline, ngCC will go away as we remove Vue engine entirely, but we're really planning to do this in stages, very, very slowly for the ecosystem, so that the ecosystem keeps working and the libraries you depend on just keep kind of working magically. We've also improved our ng update command. So ng update is our CLI command that you execute if you want to move to the latest version of Angular. Now, in the past, like if you're moving from version 7 to version 8, we would actually be using the code from the version 7 CLI to do the update. So you would always be applying an out-of-date update, which was a little bit weird. And so what we did in the version 8 to 9 update is we actually changed it to be the target, or the destination version is going to be the update process that we're going to apply. So you're always going to get the latest version of the update process. And so you're going to have the best reliability, the best documentation, all those sorts of things. So this is a one-time change that is going to affect developers now. And then you'll just see this kind of automatically from now on. But if you ever see as part of our update instructions that you should update to version 8 latest before going to 9, that's why you would want to do that. And that's just one of the kind of benefits. You don't have to do that, and I'll show that a little bit later as well. We've made huge updates to the concept of providers. So we've always had this idea of provided in. If you go back a couple of years, you could basically provide a service in a specific place. So you can either import it as a provider in a module, for example, or import it as a provider in a component. But then what we did is we switched to this thing called tree shakeable providers, where instead of providers all going into a central registry, a provider can actually add itself to the registry. And what that allowed us to do is if you never make a reference to a service, like let's imagine HTTP client, then you, even though you have it referencing some module, if you don't import it from a class, if you don't actually use it in the dependency injection system, we can leave it out. So we're always trying to make this concept of provided in and where you want to add your services into the injection tree. We're trying to make that easier. So we've added 2 new options. The first option is platform. This is where we basically have one global singleton for any Angular applications on the page. So this is relatively new, but you can imagine this being really, really useful if you know you only want one version at the root of your application, or if you're doing something like Angular Elements, where you might have multiple Angular contexts within the same page, or you might have many root nodes. You might want to use the platform provided in to make sure that your singleton, your services are available everywhere and they're sharing state. The other option is that we've created an any option, where basically anywhere that someone injects your service, they're going to get their own singleton. So this means that the service that you're creating can be provided anywhere in your app, and it's only up to the people using the dependency injection system to determine where those end up in the injector tree. All right, the next feature is called harnesses. So if you've been writing test code using Angular for a while, you've probably run into this where if you're using a component library, in order to test that component library, you actually have to reach in deep into that component and understand how it was implemented in order to test. So we see a lot of places where, for example, people are using CSS selectors or DOM nodes, and that's really, really not the best way to do it, because you end up relying a little bit on the implementation of a component in order to do the testing. And so we want these things as separate as possible, right? We want the test to be independent of implementation of some other third-party code. And so the way that we're getting around this in Angular Material is that we've created test harnesses. So basically you can, for example, create a mat select, and you can ask it to get that harness, and then you can call functions that are at a higher level of abstraction that abstract you away from the implementation details of mat select. And so if you are building any sort of code with Angular Material, definitely switch over to testing the harnesses instead of testing the implementation of those things, because they definitely do change over time. And we've gone a little bit further with harnesses in that we can actually allow you to do these sorts of things with component harnesses and test harnesses in our CDK. So generally, we have this thing called Angular Material, and we have this thing called the Angular CDK, or Component Dev Kit. And what the Component Dev Kit does is it takes the best practices that we figured out for Angular Material and makes them available for any component author. And we see huge adoption of the CDK across a ton of different component libraries out there. And so what we did is we took the same sort of test harnesses that we built with Angular Material, and we built underlying primitives and methods that allow you to build test harnesses for any components that you offer. So if you're building a component library out there, which basically every developer is, or every team is, they have some sort of shared component library, you should consider very, very strongly using the CDK and using test harnesses so that developers can rely on you and they can test you without having to rely on your implementation, which is a really, really helpful property. We've also shipped a couple new components out to the ecosystem. So as part of our components repository, we've now shipped a YouTube player. So if you want to embed a YouTube video and you don't want to use the kind of embed code, manually setting up the iframe, pulling in the dependencies yourself, you can now just add a YouTube player component with the appropriate imports, of course, give it a video ID, and then that YouTube component will show up on your application. It works just like an Angular component normally does. The other component that I want to call out is we've released a bunch of Google Maps components. So these have a lot more functionality than the YouTube component, because you can, for example, create a Google map, and then within that map, you can offer a bunch of map markers. And the nice thing here is it gives you APIs that look and feel like Angular, right? You can bind to events, you can listen to those events, you can bind to properties, you can set all of these things declaratively in your template in the Angular way, versus trying to figure out, okay, how do I spin this up in the JavaScript ways and in the ng after reviewing it? How do I make sure it's consistent? How do I change it over time? All those things are now, they just feel like an Angular component, which is really, really great for developers. And that API is very robust in terms of its capabilities. So item number 11 here is we've added support for TypeScript 3.7 and 3.8. And one of the biggest features that we hear about developers, why they care about TypeScript 3.7 and 3.8, is this feature called optional chaining. And so if you've ever worked with JavaScript, you've probably done this where you say if A and A dot B and A dot B dot C, then do something with A dot B dot C, right? You have to do all these extra checks to make sure that something is not undefined or null. And we don't have to do that anymore. Now we have this nice question mark syntax where you just put a question mark after each item. And then what it does is it automatically short circuits the evaluation of that. So we don't have, cannot access make of undefined anymore, right? This one command where I say const result equals don't make me check everything myself, we know is going to work, right? It's either going to return null into the constant, into the result, or it's going to actually succeed at each one of those levels, call the function, and get down to the value that we actually want. And so this is much, much nicer, and it allows developers to save a lot of hassle of checking those things manually. Item number 12 on our list is universal. So if you wanted to use universal, that is a fantastic idea. So there is this concept of server-side rendering. So Angular applications by default are client-side. So you're running all of the code in the user's browser. But there's also a lot of applications, and this is a really big emerging trend across the ecosystem, where we want to do some sort of pre-rendering or server-side rendering. So I define those as server-side rendering means in response to a request from the user, we are going to execute the JavaScript program and then result in a string, and then pass that string down to the user. And then you can optionally bootstrap that application after it. So we've made a bunch of updates to Universal. Two of the ones that I want to call out are that Universal now has a pre-rendering feature. So you can run yarn pre-render. And we go look at the routes in your application. We figure out what the paths that we need to pre-render are. And then you're going to get automatically out to disk a bunch of static paths. And then by default, we bootstrap the client side on top of that. But you don't have to do that, right? That's really up to you. One of the things that to think about when you think about server-side rendering is that this improves the perceived performance of your application. That's a really important nuance, because if you're doing both a server-side render and a client-side bootstrap, you can actually slow down your application in terms of total CPU time that needs to be spent. But what we see is that in practice, this improves user experience because they see the application working, even if it has to still do that client-side bootstrap on top to be fully functional. And so users in general like this, and if before they click, the application is still client-side bootstrapped, the experience is just faster and better all around. And this is actually a really interesting space that is benefiting from a lot of investment from the ecosystem. One of the tools out there that we're seeing gaining a lot of momentum and a lot of traction is called Scully, from a team that's working on what if we could build a Jamstack solution for Angular. So if you've heard of other technologies like for other frameworks, you are probably aware of this concept of, hey, maybe I don't want to pre-render my application in response to user requests. I want to do it all ahead of time. Maybe I'm building a blog where my content doesn't change very much, and I just want to host static files on the web, and I don't want to be doing any sort of functionality in response to a user request. So Scully is fantastic at that. One of the differences between what Scully does and what Angular Universal does, Angular Universal runs the entire application in a node context. And so the benefit there is that it's very, very fast, right? Because we don't need to spin up a browser. We don't need any of that extra cruft that comes from the browser. We can just execute the application in pure JavaScript. But the downside is that your application actually has to work like a JavaScript application in Node. And so that means if you use a feature like local storage, which exists in the browser but doesn't exist in Node, then your application isn't going to work in Universal. And you have to go fix that. You have to go shim those things, figure out what environment you're operating in, and then actually force that to work. So the way that Scully does this is they actually do pre-rendering via Puppeteer. So they actually spin up a headless browser, they visit all the URLs, and then they use that to generate. And so you kind of, no matter what you've done in your application, no matter what JavaScript you're relying on, even if it doesn't work in Node, you can know it's going to work with Scully, which is just a really, really nice benefit. We've heard a lot of really positive feedback about the work that we've done on Universal. Upgraded site this weekend, Angular 9 with server-side rendering. The developer experience is infinitely better now. We didn't have live reload before because we actually had to do a recompile of both the server-side rendered version of your application, so in Node, as well as a client-side reload, which was something that just hadn't been worked out, but we've added that now. So that makes it a lot easier. You don't have to go build custom web packs. You don't have to go do custom scripts. We basically have a script for you that does this live reload. So when you make a change, you're going to see it. You're going to be able to check the SSR and the client-side rendering of that universal application. This was a huge improvement that we made. So you might be wondering, how do you get all of these amazing features and benefits? And the answer is to stay up to date. We try and make it really, really easy to stay on the latest version of Angular. This is like one of the number one things that we look at every release. So with version 9, if you're not on version 9 yet, you're going to run ng update at angular/CLI at 8. And you're going to run ng update at angular/core and at angular/CLI. And we can actually take a look at this, and we'll give this a try on a real world application. So we're going to do some more dangerous live coding. So this is unfortunately dependent on the internet. So we're going to see how well this goes. But what we're going to do is we're going to take an existing application out there. We're going to run ng update, and we're going to do a little bit of bundle size analysis to really see what's going on here. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to kill this ng serve, and I'm going to ng serve this application. So if we take a look at ng version, you can see this is actually a older application. So this is running on version 7.3. So it's a little bit out of date. So this is not my application. This is a application that's out there from a company called Thinkster called Real World Angular, where they're trying to build a application that has more complexity, more nuance than a traditional Hello World application to really help developers see samples, see how to build things, and learn from it. And so if I run ng serve, we'll be able to take a look at that. If you look at the code, it's broken down into a number of different things. So you've got the normal source/app. They've got a bunch of lazy loaded modules. They've got authentication. They've got a core services library. So this is a real application with some real actual functionality. So if we take a look here, we just refresh. You're going to see this is what the application looks like. It's a enterprise style application where you've got a database, you've got sign in, sign up, you've got content that comes in from users, you've got feeds. So it's got a fair number of features that we can actually kind of rely on to know that we're building a real application. So what I want to do is I want to do a couple things. So first, I want to check the angular.json file here. So we're going to notice that there is AOT true. We're not vendor chunking. We're doing things like build optimization. And what I want to do is I want to say source maps true and named chunks true. So if you recall, I showed you that it's actually doing lazy loading with a bunch of different chunks. And you can see that in the build steps here, where we've got an article module, we've got an editor module, we've got a main. What I want to do is I want to maintain those in a production build. And so by turning that on in AngularJSON, by just saying source map true, we'll get source maps. And by saying name chunks, we'll be able to see what the actual chunk is and how it relates back to the application and the architecture that we've created. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do an ng build -- prod. So this is going to do a production build of our application using those settings we just said. So we're going to get the named chunks, hopefully, and we're going to get source maps. And source maps are going to be really critical because what we're going to do at the end is we're going to take a look at our bundle size and understand where it's coming from. So I will just let that go in the background. And while that is running, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop over here, and I'm going to start typing the command to update this project. So normally what we recommend is that you go major version by major version by major version. So if you're on version 7, move to 8, and then from 8 to 9, 9 to 10, and so on. But we're going to go a little bit off track here because it usually just works. Obviously, it's hard to debug. It's a worse developer experience. But if you just run ng update and you want to throw that at CLI and Angular core, and again, you should be using the latest version of 8 before you try and move to 9, but we're going to go directly there. And if we ran this directly, what we'd see is that we've got some dependencies that aren't compatible with version 9. Usually those aren't really critical failures. So I can just do -- force. And what that should do is that should take our application, update all those dependencies from version 7 to version 9. And then it's also going to run the migrations that make this application just work out of the box, even when we've had to have breaking changes across the application. So there we go. So our build finished. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save this dist folder into dist.7 so that we can take a look at that later and compare it side by side with our version 9 application. So as we said, it's updating the package .json dependencies. It's now updating the format of our project to match the latest standards and best practices. So it's updated our TS config, it's updated our polyfills. We can actually run git diff if we want to see what it did. So it turned on AOT by default. It's added some bundle budgets. So it's done all of these kind of very, very nice things to our project. So what we're going to do is we're going to just run an ng serve and see if that worked. One of the new things we introduced in, I believe, version 8 was analytics. So we're just going to say yes, that we want the Angular team to be able to see that we're using the CLI anonymously via Google Analytics. And then it's going to do that ngcc compilation that ensures the entire ecosystem keeps working, even if you want to switch to a newer version of Angular. And then we'll hop back over to the browser and see if this all worked. All right, that looks like it compiled successfully. And now what we're going to do is we're going to hit refresh. And if everything worked, it should just keep working. And we can actually verify that that did something, because if we look at the Elements tab here and we look at app root, we're going to see that ng version is now 9.1.9. So we're using the latest version of Angular, and we didn't really have to do anything because of all those migrations, because of all the work that the team put in. And I want to go one step further. So I'm going to do an ng build -- prod here. So we're going to get out another production build so we can compare the version 7 build with the version 9 build. I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to actually do a version 10 update. So you can see what it would feel like if you wanted to give version 10 a try, because we're in the RC period of that. So we're doing this ng build. And what we can see, what we'll actually do is we'll do a source map explorer. So if you don't have source map explorer, it's really easy. You just yarn global add source map explorer, or you can add it locally into the project. That's up to you. But once you have it, you're just going to pass it some sort of JavaScript file that has a map. So we can say dist main in our 2019 project or our Angular version 9 project. And what that should do is that should open a browser, which it did not for some reason, which is unusual. But one of the other ways that we can do this is we can actually just look at the size of the file. So if we take a look at dist star / main star, we're going to see that in version 7, our main bundle was around 385 kilobytes. But in the version 9, which is kind of the default now, we've actually dropped down to 341 kilobytes. So we've made our application 40 kb smaller without having to change any of the code. Right? These are huge gains, huge wins for developers, and that's something that we want to keep investing and keep improving on. So I mentioned that the last thing I wanted to kind of show off was a preview of the kind of version 10 update process. So I'm going to say ng update at Angular core and CLI. And I'm going to say -- next. So this is going to move us to the latest pre-release version, and I'll just throw force on because I know some of the dependencies are not compatible. So here we're seeing that nice new thing that we're using the target destination of the repository. Let's just commit this real quick. Oh, they have lint rules. All right. Thankfully, that all passed. All right. Now we're going to run our ng update command. So it's going to install the version 10 version of CLI and use that to update our old version 9 application. So we're moving from version 9.1.7 up to RC2 of Angular 10. So one of the nice things you're going to see when you update to version 9 or version 10 is all of the changes that we have to make to your Angular application. We're going to actually now print out a little migration saying, hey, we tweaked how your ES5 support worked. We tweaked how your package.json was configured. We removed your style extension with the spec file. All these sorts of things. We're going to try and not only make these updates for you so that your application just stays up to date all the time, but we're going to tell you what we're doing along the way. So that update is done. And if you really cared and you wanted to understand all the changes, you can actually take a look, for example, in Git, and you can see, hey, we made some changes to your TS config. So now we've got a base TS config. You can see we've made some changes to your package.json, obviously the new dependencies. We've also updated TSLib. We've also updated Karma. We've updated Protractor, TypeScript. All these things, they all get updated to the latest version. So that worked well. And if we run ng serve again, things should just work. And that will be our last test with this real demo example. So again, we're having to do the recompilation because we've got new versions of libraries under the hood. So we're compiling those libraries. This only has to happen once per yarn install effectively, because once the dependencies are there, once they've been compiled, we don't have to keep compiling them over and over again. All right, so that is up, and we should be able to refresh and immediately see ng version 10. So we are on the latest version. Really easy to update, really easy to give it a try. And this is something we're asking developers to do. So I'm going to jump back to the slides. So we want everyone to stay up to date. We want people to try new versions and give us a try. So obviously we have this ng update command, but if you ever want to understand and actually be guided through a process of what is this update going to do, what do I need to do in reaction to it, we have this update.angular.io site where you can type in the version you're coming from and the version you're coming to. And based on the complexity of your application, which is basically how much code have you written, how common is your use case, we'll tell you all the changes that you have to make to your app. And so how basic, medium, and complex works is basically, basic is things that everyone needs to know. Medium is apps that maybe 50% of apps need to know, and advanced is things that maybe 2 to 10% of apps need to know about because they're using some obscure features of Angular. So if you hit advanced, you're going to see absolutely every change that we make. And we can actually see this here if we go to update.angular.io. You're going to see basic, show update information relevant to all developers, medium to around 10%, and advanced, show all the information. So you're going to get a very verbose list of things that probably don't apply to you if you hit advanced. But we still want to acknowledge and document all these things for developers. So that is a really helpful tool to keep all the developers up to date. And we've actually been really surprised at the speed of adoption. So as of Q2, so effectively this month and the last month, there's already over 10,000 public production version 9 Angular applications. So what we see is that as of every major release, the previous release is used by a majority of developers. And so what that means to us is that most developers in the Angular ecosystem are keeping up to date. And that is really, really important to us so that everyone's getting the latest features, getting the latest benefits, so that we can bring everyone with us on this journey to making your app smaller, faster, easier to use. All right, so we talked a little bit about version 10. I showed you the update. We're currently in RC2. I will say, a little disclaimer, version 10 is not final. Things are subject to change. The experience you get if you try this today might be different than what you get once we're done with all this RC period. So just bear that a little bit in mind. But just a little bit of background on our release plan. What we do is we try to be very, very predictable in our releases. So we have a time-based release instead of a feature-based release. So we are going to cut new major releases about twice a year and try and keep to that as often as possible so people can plan around this. We've actually heard from a lot of companies that are scheduling their updates based on our schedule, and they're actually updating their component library in the same way, all those sorts of things. One of the main reasons we do this is to stay up to date with the ecosystem. We have a lot of dependencies in the JavaScript and the TypeScript world. And if you are not staying up to date with them, then you complicate the problem for web developers that want to be using the latest and greatest, right? Because imagine if Angular was 5 or 6 TypeScript versions behind. That would be frustrating to be reading documentation about the cool things in TypeScript, but we can't take advantage of it. And the further away you get from being current with the ecosystem, the harder it is to stay up to date. And so we see a lot of teams out there who have kind of dead code because they can't keep up with their dependencies. And so part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep it very frequent and do it for you. Keep it automatic whenever possible. And at the same time as doing all this, we really want to focus on this idea of stability and quality. So one of the ways that we ensure stability on the Angular team is that all of our commits, not just all of our releases, but all of our commits to the repository are validated against applications at Google, right? We have over 170,000 test suites. We have over 2,000 applications at Google that are projects, that are using Angular. And so we use all of those to make sure that every change we make to Angular, even the kind of every commit level change, don't break the world. And so we kind of hold ourselves accountable to that. And another way that we hold ourselves accountable to that stability and quality is that if we do break something, right, we do break 1,000 applications at Google, it's not actually up to them to go and fix their apps. It's up to us to go and fix them. And so the only way we could scale this across the world for you as well in the external world is by automating this. And so we offer the same benefits to Google that we do to the world, which is very, very nice. So version 9, we are moving to TypeScript 3.9. We've removed a few of the deprecated APIs. One of the things you'll notice is that this release, version 10, is really, really focused on cleanup. So we landed Ivy in version 9 as opt-in. It is still opt-in in version 10, but we're starting to remove some of the older APIs. We're starting to remove some of the backwards compatibility from even earlier versions, kind of according to our N+2 backwards compatibility policy. And you also notice that because version 9 came out in February, version 10 is a little bit smaller than our average release. We're trying to make sure that we maintain that cadence that's predictable by web developers. We've done a bunch of improvements around strictness. So we can now kind of default new projects to strictness within TypeScript and within Angular, which is really, really nice. We've also started pulling back some of the budgets because I've done a bunch of scanning of the ecosystem. And what I see is that the average Angular application out there is like 4 megabytes, which is crazy. 4 megabytes of JavaScript, so not even including images, CSS, or anything like that. One note that I've seen in my testing is that non-Angular apps are about 5% bigger. So Angular has that going for it. But this is still much too big, right? If we're focused on users and global experiences in low connectivity environments, 4 megabytes is way too much. It's too much for slow processors, all these sort of things. So we're starting to pull back the budgets if you opt into this so that you can know when you accidentally make your application bigger, when you pull in a new library like Moment and it pulls in 6 copies of the locales, we want you to know about it so you can act on that and make an intelligent decision as a developer versus kind of just having these things accidentally hurt your user experience. One of the things that we just did last week was we did a triage fix-it. So if you saw a bunch of GitHub activity, that was what was going on. We touched over 2,000 issues. One of the really interesting data points that came out of that is we spend a lot of time on community responses. We really, really care about issues that people send us and PRs that we send. The average issue took more than 10 minutes for us to actually look at, think about, do reproduction, make sure that it's doing that. has the information that we need to actually go fix it. So this is not even including fixing time. It's just to triage and to look at these issues. It took 10 minutes a piece. So this is a journey that we're on. We want to do more and more where we're spending more time on issues, more time on PRs. We want to really encourage a community and ecosystem where anyone can collaborate. So we're spending a ton of energy on that. And we really want to hear from you. We want you to be part of the ecosystem, and we want anyone to kind of be able to get in, modify Angular. That was one of the big goals of Ivy, was simplification, so that more people can get in and actually affect the future direction of Angular. So the last thing I want to leave you with is that if you have thoughts, you have ideas, you have feature requests, you have feedback, we are always listening. So we want you to file us issues. If you're trying out the version 10 RCs and something doesn't break, if something didn't work out of the box automatically, tell us about it so we can fix it, so we can make the releases better, so we can make the product better, and so that we can make the ecosystem better. Because at the end of the day, we're here to make developers successful, and we can only do that with your help. That is going to be it for me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Stephen. It was a great presentation. We have some questions for you.
Absolutely.
All right. So first question from Philip Mendes. Well, he has two questions. The first one is, when do you believe typed forms will be a reality?
When will typed forms be a reality? So this is one of the top issues, if not the top issue in our GitHub, according to reactions and mentions and things like that. I cannot make any sort of timeline. I will say the Angular team talks about that a lot, and it is near the top of our priority list. So I can't make any guarantees about timeline, but we know about it. We want to fix it. It's in our roadmap to fix. I just can't tell you when.
Thank you. Second question, also from Felipe Mendes, is which are your expectations for Angular framework in 5 years?
Sure. What are my expectations for the Angular framework in 5 years? Well, there's probably a lot. So I think one of the things is that we have this general vision of getting to a place where people don't even worry about the version number. So kind of you can imagine an Angular evergreen where all the developers are just kept up to date automatically all the time. And then you don't have to worry about that, and just features kind of just show up in your application. So we think that would be a really nice vision. Another area that I think in 5 years will kind of be bad. I want to stop talking about Ivy. We've been talking about Ivy for a couple of years. It brought all these kind of benefits. We have a bunch of ideas for additional benefits that should be bringing, like additional tree shaking, additional bundle size reductions. So I think we want to get past some of those, get Ivy, just remove all the old version, all the compatibility stuff, and then just everyone kind of be back into this idea of Angular Evergreen where you get all those benefits and you don't even have to think about it. So I think getting past some of these major migrations are going to be a big part of it. And then it depends, right? Like one of the things we pride ourselves on is keeping up to date with the web. So for example, right now there's a lot of discussion. There's new browser APIs called trusted types, where there's actually more secure ways of representing things within JavaScript. And so Angular in 5 years, we want to stay up to date with the ecosystem, right? TypeScript is huge right now. We were very, very early on in that TypeScript adoption. But at the same time, we're planning for change, right? We know that things are going to change in the JavaScript ecosystem, and we want to be able to think and pivot intelligently in a way that keeps the ecosystem with us. So there's a lot of those that we're exploring and discussing, like optional modules, optional zones. Should we make it easier for developers to use Cypress? Should we make it easier for developers to use Jest? Should we be able to do more lazy loading at any level of the component tree or service tree, all those sorts of things? So we have a lot of really cool ideas that we think are going to make developers life simpler and easier. And we're just going to keep moving forward towards that.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephen. We have no more questions. It was a great presentation. A big applause to you by all the attendees. And thank you very much for being with us. We hope to see you next year in JNation. And to all of you guys that have been attending to this session, enjoy the break and see you in about 12 minutes.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Bye, Sim. Thank you again.